When most of us think of World War II, we often picture the conflicts between the European nations, the Holocaust, and the Japanese-American conflicts of Pearl Harbor and the nuclear bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. However, many battles were happening in Asia as well. We know this to be the Pacific War. Today we will be focusing on the Second Sino-Japanese War, which revolved around the two main countries of the Empire of Japan and the Republic of China. This war began with the Marco Polo Bridge incident on July 7, 1937, and ended with the surrender of the Japanese on September 2, 1945. To better understand the cause of the Second Sino-Japanese War, we must first understand the situation in China at the time, the tensions between China and Japan, as well as the intentions of Japan. There were three major events that set the stage for the Second Sino-Japanese War. These events were the First Sino-Japanese War, the Chinese Civil War, and the Japanese invasion of Manchuria. China lost to Japan in the First Sino-Japanese War and had to follow many terms laid out by the Treaty of Shimonoseki. Articles 2 and 3 instructed China to give Japan some of their land, including the Pescadores Islands, the Liaodong Peninsula, and the island of Formosa. Article 4 was for China to pay a war indemnity of 2 million Kuping taels, which today is the equivalent of about $5 million to Japan. China was also to open up 4 ports for Japanese access, as stated in Article 5. Japan used over 60% of the war indemnity in increasing their military weapons and equipment, and over 20% was spent on temporary military expenses. The Chinese Civil War was fought between the Chinese Communist Party and the Kuomintang, the Nationalist Party. The Xinhai Revolution was led by Sun Yat-sen and caused the fall of the Qing dynasty, ending over 3 centuries of imperialistic rule and causing the creation of the Republic of China. After the revolution, Sun Yat-sen was elected as a provisional president, and China became under a nationalistic rule. Sun Yat-sen was succeeded by Chiang Kai-shek after his death in 1925. By 1927, the support for the Communist Party had grew increasingly, and a series of conflicts between the two parties ensued. However, a few years later, when the Japanese began their attacks in China, the two parties would put their war aside and work together to try and defeat the Japanese. In 1931, Japan invaded Manchuria. Japan relied heavily on the United States for metal and oil and wanted to have access to these resources themselves, as well as coal and lumber. Manchuria had these resources, and as Japan already owned the Liaodong Peninsula, they had easy access and the perfect route to Manchuria. Japan had found the perfect time and place to invade, and they had the power to do so. China's power struggle between the communists and the nationalists left the country in a state of weakness. Japan had easy access to Manchuria, their military was well trained and strong, and they also had new armaments, which they procured with the war indemnity from China. Japan succeeded in their invasion, and they established a puppet state under the name of Manchukuo, led by the previous Chinese Emperor, Puyi. This leads us to the Marco Polo Bridge incident. This incident was not the sole reason that the war started, but rather it was the spark that ignited the fire. It started on July 7, 1937, when the Japanese units held military exercises on the other side of the Lugo Bridge. One night, a Japanese soldier was found missing. So, the Japanese army demanded permission to enter Wanping, the town on the other side of the bridge, to search for the missing soldier, but China refused them entry. However, Japanese troops went ahead to the city, and by the morning, the city was completely surrounded. The war had begun. The Battle of Shanghai was one of the bloodiest battles of the Second Sino-Japanese War and has been described as Stalingrad on the Yangtze River. At first, Chiang Kai-shek was against the idea of fighting the Japanese, as seen through his slogan of first internal pacification, then external resistance. However, on August 13th, as the Japanese army began their attacks in Shanghai, Chiang Kai-shek began to see no other option but to fight back. The next day, August 14th, he issued out the Proclamation of Self-Defense and War of Resistance, telling the Chinese people that they must fight back and protect their nation. The Japanese army was far too strong for the Chinese, as they fought from the air, from the sea, and on land. The Chinese army only fought with their small caliber weapons on land. Though China lost in the end, they did surprise the Japanese with their perseverance and resistance, as Japan thought that they could capture Shanghai in just 3 days and all of China in 3 months. Yet the Battle of Shanghai lasted for 3 months itself. After their loss to the Japanese at the Battle of Shanghai, the Chinese made new strategies in preparation for the Japanese capture of the capital city of China at the time, Nanjing. They gathered soldiers and troops, but most were untrained and ill-prepared for battle. Chiang Kai-shek also relocated the government to Chongqing, a city in the interior regions, as a temporary capital. There was also a demilitarized zone called the Nanjing Safety Zone, which would later save more than 250,000 people. The mayor of Nanjing ordered all Nanjing citizens to move into the safety zone, and more than 3/4 of the population of Nanjing fled the city before the arrival of the Japanese. The Japanese military did not recognize the Nanjing safety zone formally, but they did agree not to attack places without Chinese military forces. And they did respect the zone somewhat, as they did not intentionally fire into the zone. However, as the battle went on, some of the Japanese soldiers began to disregard the safety zone and took people out of the zone and raped or killed them. On December 9, 1937, the Japanese military gave the city of Nanjing 24 hours to surrender. No answer was given, so they went on with their attack, surrounding Nanjing walls on all sides. The Japanese army committed many war crimes in the Nanjing massacre. 20,000 women were raped, even infants, young girls, pregnant women, and elderly women. More than 12,000 people were mass executed in a trench. Chinese soldiers and other young men were taken to the Yangtze River to be executed by firing squad. Others were doused in gasoline and set on fire. The Nanjing massacre was a horrific event, sometimes even referred to as the Asian Holocaust. Historians have not been able to determine the exact number of deaths, as most military records of the killings were either destroyed or kept secret after the Japanese surrendered in 1945. However, the Nanjing War Crimes Tribunal estimated that there were around 300,000 Chinese deaths. After the Japanese captured Nanjing, they then captured many of the other eastern provinces. This series of battles is known as the Battle of Wuhan and took place over a period of 4 months and a half. The Battle of Wuhan caused many casualties in both the Chinese and Japanese armies. However, the Japanese was not discouraged by this, as this prompted their attack on Pearl Harbor. Some Western nations were already suspicious and fearful of Japan prior to Pearl Harbor and acted accordingly. The Soviet Union signed the Sino-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact and supported China by sending the Soviet Volunteer Group, a group of Soviet air forces, in hopes of defeating the Japanese. The United States also cut off all their oil trading with Japan in hopes of defeating them economically, as Japan relied on the US for about 90% of their oil imports. The US also sent the American Volunteer Group, a squadron, to defeat against the Japanese attacks in Burma. But it was only after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor that the US declared war against Japan. With this declaration, many other Western nations also realized the reality of Japan's aggressions. These countries were the Soviet Union, Germany, and the United Kingdom. Both Japan and China were extremely strategic in the Second Sino-Japanese War. Japan's plan was to take over China quickly from north to south and planned the entire capture of China to take just 3 months. Though China already received aid from other nations, it was not enough. China knew that they could not stand against Japan's army, but they knew that they could hold off the Japanese army just long enough so that they could move their capital from the busy city of Nanjing into the interior regions to the city of Chongqing, which the Japanese would not be able to reach as easily. The war ended on September 2nd, 1945. There was not really a clear winner of the Second Sino-Japanese War. Japan's surrender was the reason for the end of the war, but the reason for its surrender was not because of China's victory. Rather, it was the American atomic bombings of Nagasaki and Hiroshima that drew the final straw for the Japanese. The war was over, and China finally had a period of peace after many years of many battles. However, it did not last for long, as China now had to face some of the issues they had put aside in the war, one of them being the rise of the Communist Party and the other being the Chinese Civil War. By this time, the Chinese Communist Party had an army of almost 1 million soldiers and was still gaining support rapidly. The two parties, the Nationalists and the Communists, resumed their civil war after the end of the Second Sino-Japanese War. Since China had been in war for a number of years, they never quite got to rest. As a result of that, everyone was tired and struggling to recover from their losses. In these moments of desperation, many saw Mao's communist utopia and ideology as their only way to procure their basic needs. China was not used to any other form of government, as the only rule that they had been under was the imperial rule, where an emperor would own all. Eventually, the Nationalist Party realized that they could not defeat the Communists. So, in 1948, Chiang Kai-shek led the supporters of his Kuomintang Party and about 2 million nationalist soldiers as the Republic of China to Taiwan, an island off the coast of China. Mao then established mainland China as the People's Republic of China in 1949 and ruled as the chairman of the Communist Party of China. Though most would not first picture the Second Sino-Japanese War when thinking of World War II, it was truly a series of bloody battles that contributed to many changes that would result out of World War II. The Second Sino-Japanese War caused Japan to want to attack Pearl Harbor, which then brought the US into World War II. This war also caused the division of China's territory into two governments of communism and capitalism, changing China forever and also bringing a question of political status to the Chinese community. The Second Sino-Japanese War was just an example of how World War II changed the world drastically. This war caused a great power struggle between the two governments, as they both still fight to be recognized as the legitimate China today. And that's what the Second Sino-Japanese War is all about.